Hello, good afternoon. So I will be chairing this second session today. And first of all, I would like to thank the University of Barcelona and the chair, Maite in particular, for organizing all of this, and to congratulate Elisenda on her first successful symposium. So it's been a very interesting program, both yesterday and today. And I think what we're going to discuss now in this next session is moves on from the discussion about people and technologies that was discussed in the previous session. So we're looking at flexibility, with a focus on demand side, consumer behavior, and potential benefits of energy policies that promote engagement of consumers on the demand side. These are driven in particular by the energy policy at national and European level, and in this context, maybe the clean energy package by the European Commission recently approved, again, highlights the importance of flexibility and demand side participation. The speakers in the session have an established record in energy research and are part of very thriving and dynamic research group, and will address topical issues both from the point of view of academic content and relevance to the policy arena. Now, the contributions take into account the barriers that are faced by consumers in engaging in the flexible and decentralized energy system. And to some extent, there is an initial link with what Sarah's consideration about technology and how people use the technology. In my view, one of the emerging themes of the contributions from different points of view is that sometimes energy policy seems to give a lot of, put a lot of faith into technology and its possibility to promote new economic and social behavior. But the different contributions, I think, will help us understand that we also need to take account properly of consumer behaviors and situation of market failure where technology is unable to address the issues. And this reminded me of a quotation that was presented yesterday during the business symposium. It was a quotation from Steve Jobs that was saying, it is not faith in the technology, is faith in people. So basically we're gonna discover all of the issues that are associated with people interacting with technology, keeping in mind, again, another important piece of information that was revealed yesterday in the presentation by the Repsol representative, who was saying in their study of their consumers, their customers' behavior, 44% of the customers were not interested in engaging with energy supply. So we are building all of this infrastructure, and then we have to ask, will it be taken up, and will it be done in a way that will allow us to achieve those ambitious climate change and environmental objectives? In practical terms, before I pass on to the excellent speakers, we've agreed that basically we will ask for clarification questions, brief questions at the end of each talk, and then we'll leave more time in the end to ask more complex or questions that might require a bit more time for the speakers to respond. I hope that's acceptable. So I will then first introduce Joan Batalla-Bejerano from the University of Barcelona and also director of the FUNSEAM Foundation, who's had a very busy couple of days, luckily has agreed to present his academic work. And he'll be talking about smart meters and consumer behavior, insight from the empirical literature.
Thank you, Monica, for your presentation. It's a pleasure for me to be here just presenting the results of a project that we are carrying out in collaboration with Endesa, one of the the biggest players in Spain. And the objective of the project is to analyze the potential of demand-side management initiatives, considering that the innovation, the technology, is a relevant part of the energy transition, but as Professor Darby explained before, requires the participation of the customers, the demand. So one aspect that is relevant when considering how to improve the demand-side management is the tariff design. We have to advance towards more dynamic pricing, towards dynamic time of use pricing that reflects the cost of energy at every moment, and also are able to provide the flexibility that the electricity system requires every time. I have prepared some slides. Sorry, just a previous question. This project is a long-term project, and the first phase of this project is the identification of the main insights from the empirical research and previous empirical research in the academia in the field of demand-side management, demand-side response, to take into consideration these insights when defining, when proposing new dynamic tariffs for the Spanish electricity system. So at the end of the presentation, if I have some minutes, I will explain the next steps, and I will hope that in future editions of the Symposium Academic, we will be able to explain the results from these new dynamic tariffs and the results in terms of demand-side management. With this brief introduction, let me say that in this presentation, and I will offer a very brief presentation of the new flexibility requirements that the electricity system that we are moving towards require, which is the potential of demand-side response and the benefits, and the more relevance, which are the determinants of consumer behavior. It's not just price signals. There are a lot of other considerations that have to be taken into consideration when you decide to implement new tariff design with a more dynamic perspective. And finally, as I was explained before, I will explain in 2 minutes, which is the future lines in this research. You know perfectly that Professor Boehringer explained perfectly this morning, which is the system that we are moving towards. There is an increasing participation of renewables that the majority of this renewable generation is variable and non-fully predictable. So there is an impact in terms of power system functioning that implies that we require more flexibility. Flexibility in terms of backup requirements, balancing services requirements, or adjustment services. But we don't have to forget that the demand side could provide this flexibility, and that it's an important element when designing tariffs. Until now, the flexibility required for a power system was provided by flexible generation plants. When you have a prevision that you have an increase in the peak moments demand, you have new flexible generation able to provide this flexibility, but this is expensive. So there are a lot of other solutions that can be implemented from the demand side in order to adjust the permanent equilibrium between demand and supply in this new context of electrification and increasing participation of renewables. And that it's important. For example, the European Commission pointed out 2 years ago that there is a huge potential from the demand-side response programs. Also, they have tried to estimate which could be this potential. They estimated that at the moment in 2016 it was possible to have about 100 gigawatts of demand-side response participation in the flexibility programs, but it is a question that is extremely relevant given that the majority of this flexibility that comes from the demand will be from the residential sector. The residential sector, as is pointed out in this figure, it represents at the moment nearly 30% of demand, 23% of total energy consumption. That it's a huge participation, and it could be used in terms of provide this flexibility without increasing the total cost systems of the power system. So, in order to provide this, or in order to take advantage of this potential, obviously it's necessary to have a demand side that is participating, providing these services. So we require consumers that are able to answer to the price signals that the market is offering, then providing this power that is required in order to guarantee the equilibrium. I'm not going to talk about the different demand-side response, but just let me say that there are important benefits from the demand-side management programs. In terms of financial aspects for the consumers, they can reduce the amount of money that they expend in terms of energy consumption, but also in terms of power system operation, it increases efficiency, or it could increase efficiency, reliability, and security of the system without increasing the cost of this management. So it is important to have to take into consideration which are the determinants of this demand-side response, which are the determinants of the consumer patterns of consumption. And this is not an easy question, given that it is a multidimensional phenomenon. It's not a question of price signals. There are a lot of questions related with market failures. There are externalities, imperfect competition, imperfect information, but also behavioral questions. People can not participate because they don't know which is the benefits, because they don't want to participate because they consider that there are not a significant saving associated with this participation, but also another question more related with the behavior. So it's important when designing the new tariffs, dynamic tariffs, to take into consideration this new field, the behavioral economics, taking into consideration that there are a lot of socioeconomic aspects that you have to control for, you have to consider which are the socioeconomic aspects to define the new tariffs, and also the characteristics of the house. The dwelling has a different characteristics, different sources of energy that has to be taken into consideration when defining these tariffs. This is obviously this field of research is more than 30 years. And I like this slide especially because it's a pilot project that has been carried out in the United Kingdom and in the United States from a company that at the moment doesn't exist, disappeared, that it was how was possible to have demand-side response without the smart meters. And it was really, for me, it was really funny to discover that the project was to have the BBC channels, the TV channels, offering every 30 minutes the spot price at that moment. That in the case in the United States, in the United Kingdom. In the United States, it was another methodology, another approach. It was a phone call every 10 minutes for the customers that were participating in this project, just saying, at that moment, the spot price is that. 10 minutes, you have another call, the price is going up or is going down.
All pensioners, I presume.
I have said before that the company doesn't exist at that moment, but for me, the question is that technology was not there, so obviously it was not possible to offer the price signal through the smart meters, but the design of the project was similar that we are doing at the moment. We consider that the price signal is relevant, and the question is how to offer this price signal to the customers. Then it was the BBC channel, it was the phone call, now we have the smart meters, but the question is that enough? With the price signal, we are reacting to the price signal, and it's the question I am going to answer with the insights that came from the empirical research that has been performed in the last years. Obviously, there are several studies trying to identify which are the determinants of the demand-side response. Obviously, there are significant differences in terms of approach, methodologies, scientific approaches, so it's not easy to have full comparable results. But we have tried to classify the most than 300 studies that there are in smart metering and demand-side response, and we can say that the majority of them can be classified in two families. The first, that is trying to identify which is the benefits in terms of energy efficiency, how many energy we are going to save with these programs. Another one that they are focused on the demand response. It's possible to shift the demand from the peak moments to the off-peak moments. And with this classification, the objectives behind this project or behind these studies, the first is which is the impact of time of use pricing on demand, different types of use tariffs, fixed, dynamics. The second is which is the potential benefit in terms of energy efficiency. The third, more focused in the needs of the client, normally utility, which clients are more sensible to this price signal, so they are more eligible to participate in this kind of projects. And the last one, that perhaps is the more relevant question, which is the impact of the feedback information. As I will explain in the conclusions, in the insights, is the feedback information perhaps is more relevant than the price signal. Direct feedback information on the bill, and direct feedback information, which is the perception in terms of prices, evolution of prices. And with this classification in these last 5 minutes, here you have the classification that we have done with those projects that we consider that are the most relevant in terms that they provide empirical results. They are not theoretical. They are not trying to explain which are the benefits of the potentials. They are calculating, estimating these benefits. The main insights that can be achieved through this investigation, through this research, is that there is a sizable potential when you apply time of use. The estimates go from 5 to 50% of energy savings in terms of electricity consumption, but the question is that not all the customers will respond in the same way. There are socioeconomic determinants, characteristics of the house that they have to be taken into consideration. And they have to also consider the preferences of these clients when defining time of use tariffs. The more relevant aspect, energy information feedback, is the critical aspect in order to guarantee the success of this kind of time of use. And also, it is required to have feedback programs that they have to be complemented with the price-based policies. Only with price-based policies is not enough, at least until now, where the potential savings from peak, moving from peak to off-peak periods, it's 10, 12 euros per month. It's not so much. So if you don't modify the differences in prices between peak and off-peak periods, you have to take into consideration which are the target for your time of use tariffs. And that requires new marketing methods and also to offer feedback to your clients, and it's another discussion that it will be for another moment that is related with the potential of the current smart meters in order to provide this smart information to the customers. Some research limitations that we have identified in this research. Perhaps related with the lack of information. Obviously, it's not easy to have access to hourly data consumption for a huge number of clients, but also others that are related with the approach. We have identified three main drawbacks, limitation of this research. The first one is the lack of this early information. We expect that in the future, with more access to this information, early information, it will be easier to define more smart time of use tariffs. The second question is, the majority of the research projects, obviously for an economic question, a financial question, are small projects, they are pilot projects, so the question of representativity of these results. So we consider that it's important to have high frequency and large time span data in order to provide consistent results when you analyze the time of use tariffs. And another aspect that it's relevant, that it's a question, a social or socioeconomic question, that is, when you are under this kind of pilot process, you try to be the best on considering consumption. So there is no evidence that if the people that is participating in this project, after the project, they acquire a new pattern of consumption, or they will come back to the previous patterns of consumption. So we consider that it's important to have a follow-up process in order to have evidence in order to guarantee the success of the time of use tariffs. And with my last minute, just to advance some ideas of the new further research, the next steps. As pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, this is the beginning of the project in collaboration with Endesa, that it's just to acquire a better knowledge of what is happening with the behavioral economics in electricity consumption. But in a second phase, we want to analyze which is the impact in Spain with a large database of hourly consumption of two natural experiments. The first one is the full deployment of smart meters in Spain. Last December, it was the 100% deployment of smart meters in Spain, so we expect to have data for that kind of clients. And the second one is the introduction in Spain of a kind of dynamic pricing, that is the PVPC, that is to translate a full pass-through of the hourly prices on the spot market to the final electricity, at least in the energy component. So we are going to analyze which is the impact of both natural experiments on the consumption. And then in the third and in the fourth phase is to identify, to take into consideration all the conclusions from the previous phases, and to try to implement, to develop some kind of dynamic time of use tariffs, and then with a pilot project identify which are the best relevant aspects to take into consideration when you are developing these measures from the demand side response. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. Do we have any quick questions? This, or any questions? We'll move on to the next speaker then. Are you okay from that position?
No picture yet, but I hope somebody puts it on.
Okay, so Anette from Copenhagen Business School will talk to us about real-time pricing in power markets, who gains, and if we still have some physics students in the audience, they will enjoy this. It has more of a mathematical component.
Yes. Most likely I'm the odd type in this conference, because you will not see any sort of empirical investigation here. It's a totally theoretical exercise that I pursued together with Sebastian Schwen from the department, from the Center of Energy Markets at the Technical University of Munich. And we investigated within relatively well-established setup for energy markets, theoretical setup for energy markets, real-time pricing in power markets, and we tried to figure out who is actually gaining from that, and is there always an increase in the social welfare due to more real-time pricing. And we will see later on this depends in a way. Yes, often there is an increase of social welfare, but not necessarily all the time. So I will give you a short introduction into the model and in our motivation. Then I will talk about the model. I will only present bits and pieces of the analysis because otherwise we would sit here for an hour. And finally, I will show you some of our results. So what is the motivation? That's pretty much known to all of you. The real-time metering potential has increased a lot. In the past, this was only a possibility for really large consumers of energy, usually some industrial facilities that could somehow measure in real time and could also control their procedures in real time. But due to technological developments and, of course, more IT, more smart digital developments, it's now possible to do that on the even for residential customers. And the question is, what it does in principle, it gives the option to send real-time price signals to consumers. And in my world, different from Sarah's world, I assume that these people actually react due to a particular demand function that they have. So I just overlook all the complications with, do they actually pay attention? Are they smart enough to digest all these signals? That's supposed to work perfectly well, but even then there might be issues, and that's what I'm talking about here. So what we all know is that in principle the expectation is that smart meters reduce market power because demand will become more elastic than it used to be. So this would make it more difficult for firms who have market power on the electricity markets to actually get something out of it. Then we know that it will simplify the balancing of power grids. So there's lots of money to save on that. And of course, one could also reduce the CO2 emissions if it allows us to balance the use of electricity in line with the availability of renewable capacity. And this is all perfectly well, but there might nevertheless be also a bit of room for complications. So one observation that we had was that although the technicality is there, at least in the north of Europe, in Sweden, for example, they had a full-fledged rollout of smart metering already in 2009. But a study from 2016 said that only 20 out of 200 providers of electricity in Sweden actually offer the choice or the option to have a real-time pricing tariff. That is a bit suggesting that perhaps it's not the most popular tariff that people might choose, because if it would be very popular, these utilities would offer them, but they don't. And that gave us that is part of the question is it not so efficiency enhancing after all, or perhaps the efficiency comes in places where the costs are not located, so those who actually have to decide to invest in that might think like, perhaps it's not worth it for me. So our question is how smart metering changes social welfare, consumer and producer surplus when consumers are risk averse and generating firms hold market power. So the two ingredients that are different from other studies of this in our particular model that we have chosen is that we assume that our consumers have risk aversion, they have a concave utility function, and we also assume that we have generating firms who have market power. And they can actually, to a certain extent, get something out of the smart metering and get some rents out of the consumers due to that. So there are existing theoretical and empirical studies, and you can find many more in my paper, but here I only want to refer your attention to Bornstein and Holland, which is the classical model on that, and their empirical investigation, Holland and Mansour, 2006, and Alcott. All of them are based on the assumptions of perfect competition, and they also ignore insurance effects of fixed prices. So what they do usually is they treat the uncertainty or the different levels of demand as something as if you had planned on it. So it means that in advance you knew that there will be a difference in the prices, a difference in the demand, and due to that you adapt. So they just add up all the consumer surpluses out of these different periods that they investigated, and that is their measure. And if people have a concave utility function, that's not quite the right thing to do. So here's our model. As you can see, it's highly artificial, and you don't need to believe it, and we can later on discuss how relevant it is or not, but you can just see you can construct situations that do not perfectly work. So we have a mass of n equal to 1 consumers, and we have different types of consumers. They have different levels of demand later, and this is measured with this parameter alpha. We assume that these types are uniformly distributed on 1/2 and 3/2. That's only to have an expected value of 1, to make it easy. But it has no other importance here. We have this concave utility function in a way. That's our V function. That's the surplus of the consumers. And it's a very classical quadratic utility function in a way, with some adaptations which brings in the uncertainty of demand. The way the uncertainty of demand is implemented here is that's the epsilon in this formula is you should think about it as a particularly cold winter in Scandinavia or a particularly hot summer here in Spain, where you might use more heating than you would expect or more cooling than you would expect, and you don't get extra benefit out of it. It's only because it's already so cold outside, just for keeping up the temperature, you actually have to use more. So it's not giving you extra utility, it's actually only due to outside factors it's necessary to demand more. That's the way how to think about it. And also this one we just assumed for simplicity to be uniformly distributed. That's always for simplification, not because it's particularly relevant. Then out of this setup we get a nice downward sloping demand function. That's nice because it's, again, easy to handle. And you can see it's linear in the price, and we have this alpha plus epsilon thing in the front, and this is, the alpha is the type of the consumer, and that differs from consumer to consumer, and the epsilon is a common shock, so it shocks all of them in the same way, like the hot weather or the cold weather. And we investigate what a different level of smart metering does to these people, and how we do that is we just assume that there is a certain threshold of alpha that determines who is on smart metering and who's not on smart metering. That's totally exogenous. We don't investigate actually who is deciding in favor of smart metering or against it. It's not an endogenous decision by our consumers. It's really just looking into if there would be a dictator and they would just decide who should be smartly metered and who not, what does it do? And we assume that they always start with the largest consumer. So we assume that those with the largest demand for electricity are the first to get the smart metering. So we assume of those who are on smart meters, they are actually participating in the wholesale market for electricity. Those who are not on smart metering buy their electricity via a retailer, and the retailer gives them a price before uncertainty is actually revealed. That means that they decide purely on the level of that price, whether they go for one retailer or another. We assume, as I said, market power. So we have a simple duopoly setup. Two generating firms, A and B, are capacity constrained, and they possess only the capacity KA or KB. And they have the identical technology. They have constant marginal costs. That's all not for reality, but just for keeping this simple. And we normalize that to 0. And the firms observe the total realized demand, submit their prices at or above which they are willing to produce to the system operator, and the system operator organizes the wholesale market as a uniform price auction. So it's in principle a model introduced by von der Fehr and Hubbard, and then later used by others, to have a simple representation of the wholesale market. We use that as well. And we assume, on the other hand, a perfectly competitive retail market. So they all compete on the level of the retail price, and they do that before they actually know the demand level. So I have to speed up a bit. This is our timeline, and that means here we have retailers competing in the retail price, consumers who buys the cheap or who subscribes to the cheapest retailer. Then we have the demand shock. Then there is the auction. Finally, the prices emerge on the wholesale market, and that's more or less the setup. I don't speak more about it. That's the demand function we get. It has a particular form because we have a point where it jumps because there the price gets above the retail price, the price on the wholesale market, and then our retailers are just stopping to provide to their customers. Here we get the retail prices. I don't get into that. Here we see how the capacity determines the retail prices at the end of the day, and we will only look into the right-hand angle of this picture, because there we will have no scarcity. That means we don't have rationing by the system operator. And in this setup, we have, for example, this picture. Just go back to this. If we look into the upper right of this picture here, up there, then we see that the retail price is actually zero, mainly because the capacities are large, market power is not very big. But even there, we have the possibility that we have such a picture in terms of social welfare. For relatively small amounts of smart metering, which is on the right side. So if the threshold is on the right side of this picture, nothing changes because everything is on this very low retail price. But then as soon as the smart metering increases at some point, we will actually, get into a situation where the generators get market power, and then we have this dip in the social welfare. And this is the very, let's say, strange situation where we actually have, and we could have no market power at all because the retail price is at zero. But we can also look at the same situation here where this is in our first picture. This is one step down, and also the step below that is the same in terms of the picture. This is the picture if we have retail prices above zero. There we have first a nice graph that we actually like, because there we have an increase of social welfare due to the increase of smart metering. But again, at some point, the market power kicks in and we get the dip. And I'm willing to talk more about it later, but I fear I have to stop now.
I think a couple of minutes.
Oh, I have a couple of minutes. I should do something with it. I thought I need to speed up like that.
Using my power.
Yes. Okay, that's great, because then we can also get a bit into the details, because what is actually interesting in this setup is that the more smart metering you have, the lower is the retail price in this setup, which also means that in principle, if you think about it, you are actually benefiting as somebody who is not particularly smart and doesn't use smart metering from those who actually do. So in this setup, one could also imagine that, although we do not investigate it, that the incentives to actually roll over into that segment is reduced the more of that you have. Also something to think about and perhaps to investigate in the future. We can also see that in our setup we have, with the level of smart metering, when it increases, we have a turnaround in a way. So in those sections where we don't have the market power kicking in, we have an increase in the consumer surplus and a decrease in the producer surplus due to more smart metering. But as soon as we are in this other section, it's the other way around. The consumers suffer and producers benefit. So I cannot really go into the details and the intricacies here, but one can only see it as an example of there are some unexpected things happening in this setup, and we need to investigate a bit more which of the elements are triggering this. And Sebastian and me want to look into that a bit more. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I'll ask again for any immediate questions, otherwise we'll move on. And yes, so the next speaker is Sandra Kretschmer from the Friedrich Universität in Erlangen, Nuremberg. And her talk is about the diffusion of green innovation.
At some point it comes. No, we'll do that.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to present our research on the diffusion of green innovations, and especially I'd like to present you some evidence from a field study on domestic energy storage that we conducted. If some of you have been to a newly built German residential area in the past few years, you might have noticed that there are a lot of houses with a solar panel on top. Basically, you'll hardly find a house without one. While this is a really great development from a general perspective, it brings about quite some challenges, because a recent study from the German Solar Association found that less than a quarter of the electricity generated by such private households is used by the households themselves. The rest is fed into the grid. And as you might know, the grid, our conventional grid, often cannot handle this excess electricity, which leads to voltage fluctuations, network congestions, and so on. As a consequence, the DSOs have to intervene, and also the TSOs in the end, to keep the network in balance, as we've heard before. And these measures are extremely costly. In 2017 alone, the total cost of such system security measures just in Germany were 1.5 billion euros. So there's a large scope for reducing these costs, and there are a lot of ideas on how to achieve that. And in our study, we analyzed how to enable one of these possible solutions, and that is domestic energy storage. Here you can see what we call virtually interconnected domestic energy storage. So standalone solar storage systems can already reduce the load on the network, but the ideal case would be such a virtually interconnected storage unit. For such a system, all households in a neighborhood or city have a storage unit, so the households with a solar panel. And these storage units are remotely controlled by the local energy supplier or the DSO. So together, these storage units form a virtual mass storage. And depending on the situation in the grid, the energy supplier or the DSO can then decide whether the electricity from these solar panels should be stored or fed into the grid, potentially at a later point. In the short term, this can reduce the load on the grid and can also support the grid stability, but in the long run, if this were done extensively for all solar panel owners, this would really reduce the need for feed-in management or redispatch measures by a large scope and could thus reduce these high costs that I just mentioned. But so far, less than 2% of all solar panel owners in Germany have a storage unit. So if we want this from a technical perspective, very feasible solution to be put to use, we have to ask ourselves, what do we have to do so that people or solar panel owners adopt storage units? And this is exactly what we analyzed in our study. In particular, we focused on 4 research questions. First, we wanted to know whether it's rather non-monetary or monetary utility aspects that count when deciding about the adoption of a storage unit. In a second step, we wanted to see whether the potential adopters can be grouped and whether they can be characterized individually. Our third step was then to see whether we can identify what really motivates and drives the adoption of a storage unit. And in the last step, we wanted to see whether we can then identify which type of consumer a potential adopter is. To tackle these questions, we conducted a field study among the main storage unit target group, which is solar panel owners. And we were supported by the local energy supplier and DSO, who had, at the time that we sent out our survey, just launched a pilot project on such virtually connected energy storage. And quite successfully, since 2015, this virtual domestic energy storage system is providing balancing energy for the local distribution network, and they still do. After excluding outliers, we had a total data set of 582 households, and we collected a multitude of different measures, as you can see here. I won't go into detail too much. We have all the typical social demographic measures, but we also have psychological measures, for example, on risk aversion and trust attitudes, also on information channels, media use, attitudes regarding some energy-related topics, because we know from the literature on decision-making and technology adoption that such adoption decisions are heavily influenced by personal attributes, beliefs, and attitudes. I'd like to draw your attention to our two main variables of interest, which is firstly the importance of different storage unit purchase criteria, which we use to group or segment the potential adopters into different groups, and the willingness to invest, which is our main dependent variable. So in the first step, we conducted a correlation-based average linkage clustering to, based on the importance of several purchase criteria, which we used as a segmentation variable. These were supporting the energy transition, using an innovative technology, supply security, and financial aspects. And based on these variables, we were able to find 4 distinct clusters, which are robust to randomization and exclusion of data. And these clusters are a finance-oriented cluster, a security-oriented cluster, idealistic, and a multilaterally oriented cluster. In this figure, you can see the respective importance ranking of these 4 purchase criteria for each of the 4 clusters. So unsurprisingly, for example, for the finance-oriented consumers, the most important purchase criterion is financial aspects. For the security-oriented, it's, for example, having supply security, and financial aspects are relatively less important. For the idealistic consumers, it's rather supporting the energy transition and using an innovative technology that seems to be important when thinking about adopting a storage unit. And lastly, we have what we call a multilaterally oriented cluster, because they rate everything as equally important. And I stress equally important because they really rate everything as important and nothing as unimportant. So based on these 4 clusters, we went on to characterize them. Here you can see a very condensed overview of this characterization, which is based on significant differences between the 4 clusters, which we ascertained with various post hoc tests, always accounting for alpha error accumulation. As you can see, the 2 largest clusters, so the finance-oriented and the multilaterally oriented consumers, they are the comparably less promising adopters with regard to imminent adoption of storage units, at least in the close future, because they both have a relatively low willingness to invest, are very skeptical of the technology, have a weaker socioeconomic background, and a very strong focus on the financial aspects, which right now are not as economically viable. If we look, however, at the idealistic and the security-oriented consumers, we see that these are more promising. They both report a high willingness to invest. Also, most people who then in the end participated in this pilot project I mentioned were from these 2 clusters as well. They have a strong socioeconomic background, well-educated. Especially the idealistic consumers are very future-oriented and technology-interested and have a very strong environmental concern, while the security-oriented consumers are very interested and well-informed on storage units. And this makes these 2 clusters the most promising adopters, at least in the close future. So now that we know a bit more about these different clusters, we still need to find out what motivates them to adopt a storage unit. And this is what we did using a random forest machine learning algorithm, because we faced severe limitations for regression analysis due to the very small number of observations in each of our clusters and the comparably large number of covariates that we wanted to check. Those of you who might have worked with random forests know that there's annoyingly little output that you can interpret in the end, which is why we opted for a multi-step approach. In a first step, we predicted the willingness to invest for each of the different clusters using a conditional random forest. In the second step, we calculated what is called a permutation accuracy importance, which basically gives you a ranking of the independent variables that best predict your outcome. And then we extracted the most important or the best predictors, so to say. And because random forests are random, and we wanted to make sure that the resulting ranking of the predictors we received was not, we repeated this process a lot of times with different random seeds to make sure that the ranking was robust to variations. In the end, what do we find? So, in short, we find different drivers for each of the 4 clusters. So, for example, for the finance-oriented consumers, a decisive factor seems to be their electricity consumption and how severe they rate environmental problems for themselves. For the multilaterally oriented consumers, basically having a high purchasing power and being a man makes adoption more likely. While for the idealistic consumers, it's large households with many children, also being a man. And for the security-oriented consumers, really the main motivator for adoption is how much they think that such a storage unit can provide them with supply security. Now, this information on the drivers is really only useful if we can identify which cluster potential adopter belongs to, and ideally based only on observable characteristics. And this is what we did in a final step, where we used the cluster adherence as a dependent variable and only observable characteristics as independent variables. And with both regressions and the same random forest procedure I just described, we then analyzed which of these variables best indicate or predict the cluster adherence. And as you can see, basically the only information you need to identify which consumer type a potential adopter is their age, education level, and household size. And with only these 3 variables, we achieve prediction accuracy higher than 90% for most of these clusters, except for the finance-oriented consumers, because they are a very large cluster compared to the others. So, for example, being younger and small households is rather indicative of finance-oriented consumers. Large households with many children and a high educational background is rather idealistic consumers, for example. And yeah, the other for the other 2. So, what do we learn from all this? The first thing is that even among such an already particular group as solar panel owners, we still find 4 distinct groups among this already particular group who vary significantly in various domains and are motivated by different factors to adopt a storage unit. Especially the relative sizes of the 4 clusters are very meaningful for policymakers in designing their interventions and their strategies, while especially for large-scale diffusion, the relatively or comparably largest cluster of the finance-oriented consumers will play a major role, while our characterization suggests that they can be easily motivated with financial incentives or support mechanisms. So now that we know a bit more about the adoption process of domestic storage units, there is large scale to build on our research, for example, by extending the scale of the study or by comparing our findings, because they are from Germany, maybe to findings from other countries, so that in the end, we're able to create effective interventions that motivate and incentivize the storage unit adoption, and in the end, lead us to a greener and more sustainable energy system. Thank you.
So I think we can now open to the floor for questions to any of the speakers. Okay, we have one over there.
Clarification just for Joan. In the time of use tariff, because maybe I didn't catch, can the customers also decide with the tools where their peak hours and their rush hours are? That's just a clarification, or they just work on the signaling that the energy provider provides. And then I have a question for Professor Broom. How stark is your assumption of imperfect competition? No? How realistic is that in the market? And wouldn't, let's say, an intermediate approach of monopolistic competition with differentiated sources of energy, wouldn't that be more realistic? And then you wouldn't have a long-term producer surplus? It's just if you thought about that approach.
Thank you, Jordi, for the question. As I explained in the presentation, the empirical works that they are available, all of them present the same limitation, that is the difficulty to access to early information. So, for those projects that they are focused on energy efficiency, the majority of them they try to analyze which is the impact of a time of use, fixed time of use tariff. Fixed time of use tariff doesn't require a smart meter, for example. You can establish a fixed tariff, time of use tariffs without smart meters, and then they try to quantify which is the amount of energy that can be saved with the different measures, information measures, feedback given the details through the bill. So the question is, for these kind of studies, the customers doesn't decide anything. They have these new tariffs, and then in comparison with the group of control of customers that they don't have this kind of tariffs, it's a comparison of the different consumption patterns. So they don't decide which is the best supplier or which is the best tariff. In the most recent works, it is possible. There are a pilot project when a company, an utility company, design different types of actuation, different kinds of tariffs, and then it is possible for the client to decide which is the best tariff for them, but they are not the majority of the research studies.
To say something. Okay, now you can hear me. Okay, in terms of how realistic is the assumption of market power, that's more or less your question, I would say. And that's, of course, a deeply empirical question that I cannot answer because I'm not doing these empirical exercises. But what I would say is that at the end of the day, it depends a lot on the available capacity at a certain given time of the day, for example. In the real wholesale markets, you can measure some market power, as far as I know, as long as you have some capacity limitations. In those hours where capacity limitations kick in, you actually have market power, and you have also strategic actors in the market. And I mean, personally, as I'm originally an IO person, and that means I don't like monopolistic competition. I hate it. To be honest about it, because monopolistic competition is believing in costless entry and exit out of a market. And especially in the electricity market, I don't think it's a particularly realistic assumption, because in principle it means you have limited number of actors, but these actors do not act strategic because they fear the entry of other actors. And they are somehow dumb enough not to somehow identify their strategic potential. And that's a bit hard for me to believe. But it's, of course, something that is up for empirical investigation, I would say. So I think there are a couple of European markets where we have only few large providers, and where in certain hours where capacity is scarce, we will have market power no matter what. And it depends, of course, on how often does this really happen, whether my analysis can say anything about that. That's what I would say to that.
Any other questions?
I would just like to follow up on Anette, on your presentation. So there were two new ingredients as compared to a previous analysis. One was imperfect competition and the other one was risk aversion. And I just tried to think about what is the novelty in terms of what insights you can take from. With imperfect competition, we would think about smart metering, as you said, increases demand elasticity. So we would actually assume economic surplus with smart metering should go up, producer surplus will go down, consumers somehow will gain. With risk aversion, I would say people rate the potential losses of higher prices as compared to the potential gains of lower prices, not symmetrically, so it's not the expected value. So I would, okay.
That's about variance. It's
Okay.
all about variance of prices that you don't like.
Yeah, but I would still ask, for both dimensions that you put in, is there, from a theory perspective that you laid out, isn't there a direct conclusion how smart metering would affect economic surplus? And then, given that the two things overlay, it can be ambiguous if the two things go opposite directions, or they have to go in the same directions if they add up somehow. I just try to understand
I understand.
Fundamental points.
That's a difficult question because we need to add one feature and then the other. We haven't done that step by step, so I can't really answer it, but just my gut's intuition to this is that the risk aversion brings into the analysis the fact that you have you don't like the fact that you have different level of prices at different demand states. So in principle, if you introduce risk aversion, what you like best is a flat rate, period, because then there is no difference. So any diversion from a flat rate needs to be compensated by something else in order to make it welfare improving. The something else should usually be exactly what you would have. That would be the reduction of market power. So what could be the compensation is the reduction in market power that could compensate you, because then on average the prices would be lower due to the increase in elasticity. But in our particular model that we have, it doesn't work like that, at least not for all levels of smart metering. So in principle, what you need in this world, if you believe in risk aversion, then you need to compensate your customers for the extra uncertainty that they are supposed to bear. And this extra thing must be on average lower prices that they pay. And if this doesn't work out to a sufficient extent, you end up in these situations. So I would think that these two things are actually working, in opposite direction. And what we find here in our particular setup is that we have certain situations where it's actually going into one direction and certain situations where it goes into the other direction, because we also have certain areas where we have, due to an increase in smart metering, actually an increase in social welfare. We shouldn't deny that. But it depends on what is more important, and you should be aware of, if you go away from flat prices, you need to compensate your customers. And that might be too expensive. I don't know. In our model it was, but in the real world, this is, again, up for empirical investigations, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Sarah? Okay, over.
Thank you. Again, I'm sorry, Sandra, this is another one on smart metering. Yes, a lot of the talk about smart metering tends to be as though this is only about introducing dynamic pricing, and I just would like to hear perhaps a comment or two from Anette and Joan about this. But if we look at smart meter rollouts in different countries, there have usually been multiple objectives and different objectives. And also those rollouts have been carried out in different ways. that reflect that. So, I mean, Monica will correct me if I'm wrong, but the very first smart meter rollout in Italy, my understanding is the primary reason there was to stop people cheating on their electricity bills.
We're not India, but there were issues there.
There were a lot of what are delicately called non-technical losses, is my understanding. Yeah, you know, there's the wish to cut down on operational costs by not having to pay meter readers anymore, for example. You know, there are various motivations that go on. And also the rollouts have been carried out in different ways. Some have been mandatory, some have been voluntary. There has been a big effort made to prepare people for it, and sometimes someone just shows up at your door and gives you a new meter. Sometimes it's just a meter that you get, sometimes it's more of a package. So in Britain, for example, it's a meter and an in-home display and an installer who has been specially trained to explain it to you. So there's that package of 3 things. So I just wanted to ask you a bit about what in each of your countries you're assuming the smart meter is there for and how it's being conducted.
Would you like to start?
Thank you for the question. It's extremely relevant. Obviously, when the government decide to implement a smart meter rollout, there are a lot of possible or potential advantages. In Spain, obviously, in terms of distribution company, they improve, for example, remote control. They allowed easy metering process. It's possible for the client to increase, reduce the power contracted. So there are technical advantages associated with the smart metering or smart meters deployment. The question, and perhaps it's in the line of your question, is, for example, in Spain, the majority of smart meters, they are not in-house. So for the majority of the clients, it is the same situation to have an analogical smart meter and to have a digital smart meter. It's not true, because obviously if I want to increase my power contracted, it is easier, and perhaps the operational cost of the distribution company are not the same with or without. The question for me, and it's related with one of the conclusions of the revision of the empirical studies, is the information, the relevance of the information. Without, for example, displays at home that are able to provide some kind of information to the client, it is difficult to understand which is the advantages more than the technical advantages for the customers. And the question for me is that is the next step in the smart meters deployment, at least in Spain, where we have 100 or close to 100% smart meters deployment.
So I can only say something a bit more perhaps about Sweden and Norway. Not so much about Denmark, because surprisingly enough, we got our smart meters extremely late. Yeah, last year, compared to all the other Scandinavian countries, I would say this is extraordinarily late. And I can only say my smart meter didn't come with anything else than a smart. It just does the same as before. I mean, I don't get any information about prices, but I'm also not on a dynamic pricing scheme. So the question is a bit like, what was it in the rest of Scandinavia? I'm pretty sure it was not so much about avoiding cheating, but of course it was a cost reduction of sending out people measuring. That's no doubt that this is also a big thing here. But what it always also was, in, for example, Norway, they used to have these tariffs where the clients were supposed to pay the average price of the wholesale market for the electricity they used in the month that they were subscribed to this tariff. And they are still very popular, these tariffs there. And they worked in the past a bit like some sort of, you were a certain client, you had a certain gender, it's a bit like your study, you had a certain gender, a certain number of people living in the household, income level, blah, 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 and then you were you were supposed to have a certain pattern of demand over the year, and this way the average price was actually calculated, because they couldn't measure what you actually used in a certain month at a certain time. They could only say, you are so and so such a type of consumer, that is the typical way such a type of consumer consumes, so your average consumption must have been this, and then this is what you should pay. And this is, of course, now much more precise, because now they can actually measure what these people have used in a certain time frame. But what they still don't do is giving dynamic price signals. So that's still not really very relevant. What they still pay after the fact, they get a different bill. But this is not incentivizing, and that might not have all the positive effects that we usually believe this could have, that you get a price signal, so you know, there is no wind right now, so I better don't put on the dishwasher or something like that. That is not how it works, also not in Norway.
Okay, I wonder whether maybe I can take advantage of my position and maybe ask a couple of questions of Sandra's work, even that actually I have been doing in the little time I have for research, some work on diffusion. And I had a couple of questions. The first one was really the background to the study. I wasn't sure whether it's a private company that engages with the panel owners, or is it more organized by a council, and actually whether you think it might make a difference. And the other one, more methodological, is whether your approach, which is quite novel and rather complex, does it allow you to assess the relative importance of different factors?
Mm-hmm. So regarding your first question on the background of the study, so this swarm pilot project was conducted by the local energy supplier, the DSO, a university, and a storage unit provider together. The customers who were approached as potential storage unit adopters who could participate in this project were all customers from the local energy supplier, because this energy supplier was the only one who offered tariffs for solar panel owners, so where they could use their own electricity and also purchase electricity from the grid. That's why they were all from the same provider, but actually all solar panel owners in that area were customers of that provider, so we couldn't have reached them otherwise.
Okay, yeah.
And the second question was, you wanted to know whether we could really get the importance of different purchase criteria, or what do you mean?
Actually the different factors that you're saying drives the adoption. Is it, I don't know, gender more important than
I see what
education?
You mean. So you mean kind of the marginal effect?
So I was thinking, you were saying basically traditional, say, econometric methods. I mean, I would have thought a probit model would be what you'd normally do, and there you can see actually what matters more and what less.
Yeah, so that's what we wanted to do initially, but we had the problem that we had, for example, in the idealistic cluster only 50 households, and we had more than 200 independent variables that were potentially a driver, so we couldn't test them all at the same time, which is why we opted for a random forest, because random forests have the capacity to analyze a lot of variables for very few observations. And the problem is that there's really no output, actually. So the typical setting which you use random forest was to predict something. So we predicted the willingness to invest, and then we calculated this importance ranking. You get the variables that are important for predicting the outcomes, or for example, if we take the finance-oriented, for example, for adoption, it was electricity consumption. But this is the only information you get. So you can then look at your data, but there you'll only see a correlation. And the problem is that random forests, they can identify interactions of higher order, which you cannot capture with a regression, which is why we tried to take the best variables, put them into regression analysis and see what happens. But often, these most important variables, they are important because they are interacting with a lot of other factors. So for example, if you're a low-income household with a high electricity consumption, that might be one connection. I mean, we tried to test some of them, not really meaningful results, which is why we only know, okay, electricity consumption seems to matter. we see that it might be high electricity consumption that drives it, but we can't be sure, which is why this would have to be tested in a larger scale with a lot more observations, so that you can really use regressions.
And potentially see more variation if you capture different types of consumers.
Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the... So I guess something I learned from previous presentation was that given my Italian background, I fully subscribe to the idea. So Maria Loureiro told us that food ranks very high in the happiness index. So I think if we're allowed maybe to go for lunch at this stage, it would be a welfare improvement, I guess. Okay, then. Thank you very much.